Mr. Steinbank, if you're ready, we will continue. Oh, lovely. We now come to the backbench debate on the contributions of Commonwealth troops in the First World War. I call Jazz Athwal, who will speak for up to 15 minutes. Jazz Athwal.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I grew up in Ilford as a youngster with my childhood friends, Harp, Sukkah. We're ordinary lads, bound together by a love for football, oblivious to the fact that our fathers, grandfathers and great-grandfathers, whilst unknown to us, could have similarly been bound together, but on the battlefields of Europe. How were we to know? It wasn't taught in schools, nor was it shown on the silver screen. Films I watched as a child. It was as if the heroism of the troops from what we now call the Commonwealth had simply been airbrushed out of history. But the reality is very different. When Britain entered the war, the First World War, in August 1914, it did not stand alone. From across the oceans, continents, from villages and cities thousands of miles away, the Commonwealth answered the clarion call. They came from Canada, from Australia, from New Zealand, from the Caribbean, from Africa, and from the Indian subcontinent, then known as British India. Different languages, different cultures, different faiths, yet they stood together under a shared purpose. They stood together because in that moment the Commonwealth stood as one. On Monday, as we mark Commonwealth Day, a moment not only of celebration, but of remembrance. Remembrance of the extraordinary contribution made by soldiers from across the Commonwealth, men and women whose courage and sacrifice helped shape the world we live in today. The First World War is often remembered through images of muddy trenches in France and Belgium. Yet the reality of war was far wider. The war stretched across continents, from fields of Flanders to the deserts of Mesopotamia, from the mountains of Gallipoli to the plains of East Africa, and across all these theatres of war, soldiers of the Commonwealth fought and fell side by side. Over 620 Canadians answered the call, more than 416,000 Australians enlisted, around 136 New Zealanders served. From the Caribbean, thousands volunteered for the British West Indian Regiment, crossing oceans to fight a war not of their making. And from the undivided India, the contribution was immense. More than 1.3 million soldiers from the Indian subcontinent served in the First World War, in the trenches of Europe, the deserts of Africa, and the battlefields of Middle East. Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, standing shoulder to shoulder with the British Tommy. They travelled thousands of miles from home, leaving behind families and communities who would carry the weight of their absence for a lifetime, because many would never return. Most had never seen Europe before. Many had never known the freezing winters of the Western Front. Yet, when they arrived, they faced one of the most brutal forms of warfare the world had ever witnessed. At the onset of the Great War, King George V appealed directly to the proud martial tradition of the Punjabis, invoking a single powerful word: izzat, honour, duty, reputation. He declared, and I quote, "Officers, non-commissioned officers and men, I look to all my Indian soldiers to uphold the izzat of the British Raj against an aggressive and relentless enemy." It was a deliberate and unmistakable call to men whose identities were rooted in honour, whose regiments carried generations of service, whose sense of duty ran deep, and they answered. A few weeks later, as the situation on the Western Front became increasingly perilous, the Secretary of State for War, a certain Lord Kitchener, rose in Parliament to steady a nation anxious about defence in Europe, he told the House in the other place, on their way from India are certain divisions from the Indian Army composed of highly trained and very efficient troops and a body of cavalry, including regiments of historic fame. His speech in the other place was received to rapturous applause. Those words carried urgency and hope because reinforcements were coming across thousands of miles of ocean. Ships pressed westward, carrying men who had never seen Europe. In September 1914, Indian troops arrived in France. Within weeks, they would be in the trenches. Amongst them were men of the Lahore Division, recruited largely from the Punjab. They were amongst the first colonial forces to land in France to defend the crown. The Sikhs had well and truly arrived. Landed in Marseille, greeted like heroes, French women rushed forward with flowers and embraces, hailing them as the saviours of France. But admiration could not shield these fine men from what was one of the most desperate moments of war. Within weeks, they found themselves fighting on the fiercest battles of the conflict, the First Battle of Ypres. German forces launched massive assaults, determined to break through Allied lines. The fighting was relentless. Trenches were overrun. Artillery pounded the earth day and night. Machine gun fire swept across the fields, and those trenches stood soldiers who had travelled from the golden fields of Punjab, from Bengal, from villages across the Indian subcontinent. Amongst them was a Muslim soldier, Qureshi Khan, a machine gunner from the British Indian Army. And in October 1914, his unit came under overwhelming attack. German troops advanced in large numbers, intent on tearing through Allied lines. One by one, the soldiers around him fell. But Khan did not waver. Even as he was badly wounded, he stood relentless in the face of the enemy. His courage held the line, delaying the German advance and preventing a breakthrough that could have changed the course of that battle. For his extraordinary bravery, he became the first Indian soldier, a Muslim, to receive the Victoria Cross, the highest, most prestigious medal of all. His story reminds us of something profound. Heroism knows no nationality, courage has no borders. And across the Commonwealth, millions of soldiers stepped forward. They were farmers, students, labourers, clerks, teachers, ordinary people placed in extraordinary circumstances. And in the trenches, life was very harsh and unforgiving. Mud-filled trenches, shell fire shook the ground, cold winters, relentless rain turned battlefields into oceans of mud. Letters written home never reached. One soldier who wrote home of a cold that pierced through his uniform, of frost covering the ground, of the sheer strangeness of a fighting in a land so far from home, and yet they stood firm. Because in the trenches it didn't matter where you came from or the colour of your skin. What mattered was who you stood beside. A Sikh soldier sharing a trench with a Scottish Highlander, a Muslim cavalryman alongside an English infantryman, a Caribbean volunteer marching with an Australian battalion. Different faiths, different languages, different cultures, and yet united by a shared commitment, united by loyalty, united by courage. The story of the Commonwealth in both the world wars is not only the story of soldiers, it is the story of labourers, nurses, porters, and support workers, the men and women whose efforts, who made victory possible. Everywhere across the war, the Commonwealth was present, and everywhere the cost was immense. More than 1.1 million soldiers from across the British Empire and the Commonwealth lost their lives in the First World War, according to records maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission.
Although, thank you, why is that?
Of course.
Fine.
I thank the honourable member for my honourable friend for giving way and congratulate him on securing such an important debate. Can I join him in paying tribute to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, who do such important work conserving these sites across the country? I was lucky enough to have a tour of the Holy Ghost Cemetery in Basingstoke, and we also recently, and will you also join me in paying tribute to the volunteers that do the important work preserving these sites, ensuring that troops from across the Commonwealth, their service and sacrifice are honoured both today and into the future.
Thank you. Thank you for that intervention, and I absolutely agree with everything my honourable friend said. From undivided India alone, around 74,000 soldiers were killed, each a son, a brother, a husband, a friend, each one a life cut short by war. For many years, the full story of the Commonwealth contributions was not widely recognised. Remembrance often focused on Europe, but gradually the history is correcting that imbalance. Research by British Future found that in 2014, only 22% of people knew that Muslim soldiers fought for Britain in the First World War. By 2018, that figure has risen to 38%. But there's a lot of people out there who still are oblivious to that fact. Soldiers from the Christian faith remain the most widely recognised at 79%, whilst awareness of the Sikh contribution rose from 34% to 38%, with Jewish and Hindu soldiers also increasingly recognised. They also found that 75% of public agree that learning more about South Asian contribution to World War history could help social cohesion in Britain. So it's encouraging to see that this growing recognition of ethnic and faith diversity of the armies that served in Britain. One example is Hardeep Malik, a Sikh, the first Indian Sikh to fly as a pilot in the Royal Flying Corps during the First World War. He had joined the Corps in 1917, after initially being rejected because of his colour of his skin. Yet he persevered, flying combat missions over France and Italy, even facing the famed Red Baron. He also went on to play first-class cricket for Sussex and Oxford University, where he studied. Hardeep Singh Malik lives in our memory today. And through the words spoken in this House or across Britain and throughout the Commonwealth, historians, museums and memorial organisations are working to ensure that the sacrifices of all those who served are remembered. No story left behind, no hero forgotten. Institutions such as the Imperial War Museum preserve letters, photographs and personal accounts from soldiers across the world. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission maintains cemeteries and memories across more than 150 countries. When we visit these cemeteries today, we see something absolutely remarkable. Row after row of headstones, some marked with a Christian cross, some with the Islamic crescent, some with Sikh khandas, some with the Hindu Om, and some with no religious symbol at all. Different names, different backgrounds, but equal in sacrifice, equal in remembrance. The story of the Commonwealth soldiers in the First World War is more than a chapter of history. It's part of the foundation of the modern Commonwealth, a testament that long before globalisation became a common phrase, people from across the world were already connected through shared struggle and shared sacrifice. It reminds us that the diversity has always been part of our story, long before the community's contribution to our NHS, to our public services, contributions that today are so often the only measure used to justify our belonging to Great Britain. It reminds us that unity, true unity, does not erase our differences, it embraces them. Because the men who fought in those trenches together did not become the same. They remained proudly of who they were, but they stood together. And sometimes that is what matters most. As we mark Commonwealth Day, we reflect on the contributions of the diverse communities who came together to defeat tyranny. And we remember that they came from every corner of the Commonwealth, from distant villages, from bustling cities, and from different cultures and different faiths. And yet, when history called, they answered together. They fought together, and many of them fell together. More than a century later, their legacy still speaks to us. It reminds us that the strength of our societies always come from unity, from standing together in difficult times, from recognizing that our shared humanity is stronger than the differences that divide us. So today we honor them, not only for the battles they fought, not only for the sacrifices they made, but for the examples they left behind at a time when language, race, religion and skin color are too often used to divide us. The story of these soldiers reminds us something far greater, that it reminds us that people of different backgrounds can come together in the service of something bigger than themselves, that courage transcends culture, that honor transcends borders, and unity forged in sacrifice can endure. It is easy to forget the emission of this shared history of valor has rendered the nation's classrooms, museums, silver screens bereft of an inclusive, balanced heritage education. In multicultural Britain, this has led to a lack of awareness and ultimately the propagation of misinformation in popular culture to the detriment of British Hindus, Muslims and Sikhs. An example of courage, of service, and above all, an example of unity. They came from every corner of the world, but in the trenches of the First World War, they stood as one. And because of them, we remember that the Commonwealth was never simply a collection of nations. It was and remains a community bound by shared history, shared sacrifice, and shared hope for the future. So let us remember that there is more that unites us than divides us. Thank you.
The question is as on the order paper, and I call Rebecca Smith. Backbenchers are on a 6-minute speaking limit. Rebecca Smith.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to congratulate the Honourable Member for Ilford South for securing this debate. Their name liveth forevermore. The words carved onto each stone of remembrance in large Commonwealth War Grave Commission cemeteries and memorials right around the world. Today's debate ahead of Commonwealth Day on Monday the 9th of March speaks to that phrase, suggested by Rudyard Kipling, as we remember the legacy of those we commemorate. Now, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, once referred to as the Imperial War Graves Commission, but altered in 1960 for obvious reasons when the Commonwealth was formed, represents ultimately 6 countries whose troops came together from the Commonwealth to serve in the First World War and then again in the Second World War. But within those 6 countries, many others are already also represented, as has been alluded to in the first speech this afternoon even. They're across 23,000 locations and 153 countries and territories. Now, for those who don't know, I've previously worked for the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and whereas before I'd have an hour, I obviously have a bit less time this afternoon, but I hope to do the work some justice. It's important that we reflect, Madam Deputy Speaker, that there are currently sites right across the world being impacted by ongoing conflict, but ultimately the Commission has a commitment to maintain and upkeep those sites in perpetuity. For those who don't know, there is a uniformity of commemoration that takes place with the Commission, where every single person who we are aware of having died in service in the First or Second World War receives either a headstone or a memorial. Now, these are different from village and town memorials. They are specific to the Commission, and they commemorate between the 4th of August 1914 and the 31st of August 1921, those who fell within those dates, and the 3rd of September 1939 and the 31st of December 1940. So for those of you who are visiting sites with the Commission, you might notice that some died after those ending of the war dates, but that's because they may well have died of illness after those dates. What I want to focus on, though, with the time remaining, is the contribution of Commonwealth troops across the South West. In South West Devon, my constituency, 137 are commemorated across 26 sites, and of those, 61 are from the First World War, and they represent at least 5 nations who they served with. Plymouth as a whole has over 25,000 commemorated, most significantly on the Naval Memorial on Plymouth Hoe, but also right across the city in local churchyards and villages. Now, there was a vast contribution of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and their role is to commemorate those troops, to tell their stories, and a big part of this is a project called Evermore. So 2 years ago, I would have struggled to have some of these stories, but as members of the public have made their contributions, we now have much more information about the men and women that we commemorate. So it's best to share some stories, and that's exactly what I'm going to do today. Now, Ernest John Quest was one such constituent of mine, were he still alive, who was born in Leamore and subsequently buried in the Methodist graveyard there. It's a tiny village up around the China Clay Works. It's pretty bleak, but that is where he was born and raised and where he was ultimately buried. Now, he joined the Australian munitions workers, having gone out to Australia as a British man in his early 20s. But then he came back towards the end of the war, serving in munitions to ensure that we had enough equipment to fight the war, and he only came in the beginning of 1918, but sadly by the end of the year had died of pneumonia. But because he was already here in the UK doing that work, he was able to be buried close to home with what would be called a private memorial. So he doesn't have a commission headstone, his family put their own headstone in place for him. But ultimately those munitions workers came because they were offered a freebie effectively. They came over here to work to provide that service, but are a key part of those that the commission commemorate, both here in the UK and abroad. Now, James Wilson, from an equally small part of my constituency, Yelverton on Dartmoor, and anybody who is watching this speech will know the Devon Tours Hotel, which is a key landmark on a big roundabout in Yelverton, and that was what his father ran as a boarding house. He too went to Australia, Madam Deputy Speaker, and was a single farmer in 1915 when he enlisted, and he served with the Australian Imperial Forces, and he came over here, served in France, but sadly died just after the war, again of influenza and pneumonia, and was buried in a tiny village of Meavy on Dartmoor. Now, he links very briefly to my favourite grave, not something I ever thought I would say, but when you work for the Commission, that becomes what you talk about, of a man called Charles Allen, who was also Australian. And he is unique because I believe he is the only grave that is in the UK with his photograph on it. Now, he was killed in 1917. He was a very handsome man, and his granite stone cross in Ilford Cemetery has a little enamel plate with his photograph on, which when you're doing tours of that cemetery serves to show you just quite who these young men were that lost their lives. Now, again, he came to the UK to do his basic training as an Australian, but sadly died of illness before he'd even started. Furthermore, we have a South African Labour Corps buried in Wembury, probably the most picturesque location for a headstone overlooking the South Devon coast. And then finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I just want to speak of one family, the Tuckers of Yumpton. 3 brothers, all killed between the 12th of March 1917 and the 10th of August 1918, commemorated in Tynecott and in 2 French cemeteries as well. One missing, we do not know where he is buried. His brothers have graves, but all are then commemorated by the family back home in Devon. A further Tucker, not related, born in South Africa, but also commemorated in my constituency in Plymouth, who died at the age of 33. He is buried in Plimpton. Now, why is this important? We keep their stories alive. It's more pertinent now more than ever, and just to flag, we've got War Graves Week from the 16th to the 24th of May, so there's plenty of opportunity for members to show their appreciation for the work of the Commission.
Qureshi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I congratulate the honourable gentleman for Ilford South for getting this important debate. I think it's important that we recognise the contribution of the Commonwealth troops in the First and the Second World War. When we remember the World Wars, we rightly honour the bravery of British servicemen and women. But Britain did not fight these wars alone. Millions of men and women across the Commonwealth stood alongside British forces and played a decisive role in defending freedom in Europe and beyond. More than 1.3 million soldiers from the Indian subcontinent served in the First World War. They fought in some of the most brutal theatres of conflict, including the Western Front, Gallipoli, and the Middle East. It is important to remember that what was known then as British India included regions that today form India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Many of these soldiers who fought for Britain came from areas that are now part of Pakistan. Among those who served a vast number of Muslim soldiers. In fact, historians estimate that millions of Muslim soldiers and labourers fought for the Allied forces during the two World Wars. At least 2.5 million Muslims contributed during the First World War and estimated to 5.5 million during the Second World War. Across both conflicts, nearly 1.5 million Muslims are believed to have been killed in action. These men travelled thousands of miles from their homes to fight in conflicts that were not of their making. And Muslim soldiers fought in the trenches in northern France and Belgium, endured the freezing conditions of European winters, and served across battlefields stretching from Europe to North Africa and the Middle East. Many fought alongside soldiers of other faiths, sharing food, hardship and danger. There are records of Muslim, Christian and Jewish soldiers learning each other's burial rites so that the fallen could be laid to rest with dignity on the battlefield. One lady who often people forget about, a woman called Nur-Nisa Inayat Khan, who was a British Muslim woman who was the first wireless operator sent into occupied France. She was betrayed, but then arrested and tortured for months, and then executed at the Dachau concentration camp. She was given a George Cross posthumously as well. And yet, despite such enormous sacrifices, the contribution of Muslim soldiers remain largely absent from our national memory. At a time when we're seeing increasing divisions in our society, and in particular the demonizing of Muslims in parts of our political discourse and media, and some very senior politicians who should be absolutely ashamed of themselves, too often Muslims in Britain are portrayed as outsiders or as somehow disconnected from the history of this country. But the truth is different. Muslims were in the trenches of the First World War. They were there in the forces that fought fascism during the Second World War. They served in the Merchant Navy, in labour corps, and across battlefields around the world. Many of them never returned home. Their sacrifices helped defend the freedoms and democratic values that we all benefit from today. In my constituents, Bolton South and Walkden, many families trace their heritage to the Indian subcontinent, including Pakistan. For many of them, the history of Commonwealth soldiers is not a distant history. It's part of their own family stories. For example, my paternal grandfather fought in the war, and my maternal uncle had a King's Commission when at the time most people from the Indian subcontinent had the Viceroy's Commission. And that's why we have a sense of belonging to this country, and these debates like these matter. They remind us that Britain has always been shaped by the contribution of people from many backgrounds, faiths and cultures. Yeah. So when we remember the First and Second World Wars, we must remember the full story of that shared sacrifice.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And I was put on the record that the work of Nashar Inayat Khan is something that I do talk about to my daughter as well, Farah, so her legacy will not be forgotten. I call Shockat Adam.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to also congratulate the Honourable Member for Ilford South for stealing most of my speech. No, it's absolutely wonderful and very, very powerful. Madam Deputy Speaker, we live in very polarising times, as my previous speaker mentioned, where all the debates seem to be on the grounds of our lines, and on lines of our differences of what religion we are, what colour we are, what creed we are, where we come from. And these debates are sadly not just in the airwaves or in the news channels, they're also in this chamber. And it's all about what divides us and not what brings us together. That's why I would again like to, in all seriousness, thank the Honourable Member for Ilford South for bringing this debate to the chamber, because it gives us this opportunity. Because even people from my community or backgrounds or from the Empire are not aware of their own history. They're completely not aware of their own history, and therefore not giving us the knowledge to able to debate these matters coherently. The contributions made by the Commonwealth soldiers in the First World War has already been mentioned by many speakers already. There were men of every faith and no faith and every colour. And can we imagine living in Africa or British India at the time, where there was obviously no televisions and very few photographs, and they were sent abroad to a foreign land? Absolutely must have been frightening for them. May have seen it as an adventure, but as soon as they landed on this shore with these climates that they were not accustomed to, must have been a real shock to them. More than 1.3 million soldiers from British India did serve in the First World War, including over 400,000 Muslims, of which 53,000 of them gave their lives. In total, over 2.5 million Muslim soldiers and labourers from across the globe supported the Allied war effort. In fact, the work of the National Muslim War Memorial Trust reminds us that their sacrifice was immense, yet, as we have mentioned already, very unoften spoken about. Commonwealth soldiers of all faiths served in the trenches of even Europe, in the deserts of North Africa and East Africa, in Madagascar and in the Far East. And together they faced the unimaginable hardships. Together they endured gas attacks, machine gun fire and waterlogged trenches, hunger and fear. We remember that the war was not only won by Britain, but by the Commonwealth united in purpose. Yet it is very painful to acknowledge that the story told through our memorials have been incomplete. In fact, Madam Deputy Speaker, animal sacrifices in the war effort were honoured with a national memorial in Hyde Park in 2004, and rightly so. But this was way before black and Asian soldiers who fought, bled and died for Britain were recognised. And it's only recently that we begin to receive this recognition, and this is a truth that we cannot shy away from. Why did this happen? And the story that has already been mentioned, the story of Khudad Khan, who was born in 1888 in Punjab, and he served with the 129th Baluchis and became the first Indian soldier to receive the Victorian Cross. And his bravery in 1914 in Belgium, when his regiment was completely outnumbered, and he knew he was the only one alive, he pretended to be dead and slid away in the darkness of the night. And then he came back again, and he changed, indeed, as the Honourable Member for Ilford South said, the destiny of that battle. And now his descendants live in Leeds. You know, this is not somebody else's history, this is our history. Considered to Walter Tull, one of the most celebrated black British soldiers of the First World War. He enlisted in 1914, endured shell shock, returned to fight at the Somme, and was commissioned as an officer in 1917. And despite regulations that should have barred him because of his race, he continued to fight. And he was mentioned in dispatches for gallantry and coolness in Italy in 1918, but sadly 2 months later, he died because of the gas that he endured. He died in no man's land. Or we can think of Lionel Turpin, a 19-year-old from Guyana who travelled, as he called it, to the mother country to serve on the Western Front. He survived the Somme, but not the effects of the gas attack. And also we can think of the 60,000 black South Africans and 120,000 other Africans who served in the labour units. And think of the men of the British West Indies Regiment who sailed all the way from Jamaica in 1915 to train on the Sussex coast before being deployed to Egypt and beyond. These people were not footnotes in history. They should never be footnotes in history. They were the very part of the fabric of our armed forces. They should not be footnotes. They should be headlines. That's why when Lawrence Fox questioned the inclusion of a Sikh soldier in the fantastic First World War film 1917, it did not expose diversity gone too far, but history yet not understood deeply enough. Sikh soldiers made up over 20% of the British Indian Army during the war. And in my own city of Leicester, a statue was unveiled in 2022, now commemorating their service, long overdue recognition for extraordinary loyalty and courage. We recognise their bravery, we honour their sacrifice, and we commit to remembering them, because what does their service teach us today? That courage knows no nationality, no religion, and no race. If we allow polarisation to divide us along lines of colour or creed, we dishonour those who stood shoulder to shoulder in the mud of Flanders. And if we forget the global nature of their sacrifice, we shrink our own national story. So let us tell it fully, let us teach it honestly, and let us commemorate it properly, for least we forget. We dishonour not only what they endured, but the legacy that they passed to us, a nation strengthened, not diminished, by the diversity of those who defended it.
Brian Leishman.
Good afternoon, Madam Deputy Speaker. Over 1 million troops from Commonwealth nations died in the quote-unquote war to end wars. And my thanks go to my honourable friend from Ilford South for bringing this important debate today to honour their service and the service of their comrades who did survive the First World War. Now, anyone that has been in a secondary school history class knows that World War I was a result of hyper-nationalism growing across Europe, coupled with a passion for militarism. And armament is all too familiar once again today, with the perverse and frankly absurd theory that spending billions of pounds more on weaponry than on housing, health, education and funding vital public services will be the route to improving people's living standards. History also shows that after nationalism and militarism, imperialism is likely to follow. Back then, European nations were vying for resources, colonies, and the expansion of trade routes in Africa and Asia. So, war was a certainty. History also teaches us that it's mainly nations' working-class populations that are sent off to fight and die. In World War I, the working class, including from Commonwealth nations, were treated as nothing more than fodder, disposable, sacrificed for glorious imperial gain. And across 2 world wars, fanatical nationalism, extreme militarism, and the pursuit of imperial supremacy accounted for over 75 million deaths. And the contributions members from nearly every corner of this chamber make regarding us massively increasing spending to rearm the country is frankly terrifying. Do people not see that we are heading towards more conflicts, more war, more destruction, more death? The path that we are on will only lead to more suffering for the working class of all nations. War is a relatively easy thing to talk about, especially for people like me that have never served or wore a uniform. The respect and gratitude I have for those that have and do is enormous. Tragically, I find it incredible that the post-war consensus of trying to avoid war at all costs seems to have been largely forgotten.
Martin Rhodes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would start by congratulating my honourable friend, the member for Ilford South, on securing this important debate, and also for his speech so powerfully opening the debate today. Many Commonwealth troops made the ultimate sacrifice for us. In my constituency of Glasgow North, there are a number of Commonwealth war grave sites and memorials that commemorate a total of 1,100 individuals. The Western Necropolis in Glasgow North alone contains 500 service personnel from both World Wars who are laid to rest in Commonwealth war graves. Among them are Canadians, Australians, and even American volunteers who served in Commonwealth forces. These sites are an important reminder, not just of the sacrifice that Commonwealth soldiers made, but also the role that Glasgow played in the war effort, from shipbuilding on the Clyde to the hospitals caring for the wounded. However, we must also take time to recognise the contribution of those Commonwealth soldiers who made the ultimate sacrifice and yet, often due to their nationality, did not receive the recognition they deserved. These forgotten or neglected soldiers were often from the then Empire, originating from places such as modern-day Pakistan, India and Bangladesh. My honourable friend, the member for Ilford South, and also the member for Leicester South, made reference to Carns VC, who was the first Indian Muslim to receive the VC. But we must do more to ensure that others, like Carns, and the more than 4 million British Indian Army soldiers who served in the 2 world wars are adequately remembered. In my constituency, a charity called Colourful Heritage has been working hard to promote these contributions through an exhibition in Kelvin Grove Museum and educational resources for schools across Scotland, helping the public and young people to engage with this history. More recently, Colourful Heritage, with partners, has been granted planning permission to establish Scotland's first permanent memorial to the British Indian Army in the grounds of Kelvin Grove. The design was agreed upon after consultation with community and faith groups, as well as pupils across a number of schools in Scotland. It reflects the diversity of those who served: Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, and those of no religious faith. Thus far, they have raised over £100,000, with the aim of raising a total of £270,000 to complete the memorial. I'm sure that members across the House will wish them well in achieving this important goal. As we reflect today on the contribution of Commonwealth soldiers to the First World War, our understanding of this deepens over time, as new stories come to light and previously overlooked service is properly recognised. I will give way.
Thank the Honourable Member for giving way, and he's making a very powerful speech. Would he agree with me that this is where the role of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and particularly their public engagement coordinators, is so important to go out and tell those stories? Because actually we have graves right around the country of Indian and Muslim, Hindu, Sikh service personnel, but actually ensuring that communities understand that they are in our midst is very important, as is highlighting the Neuve Chapelle Memorial to the Indians on the Western Front as well.
Martin Rhodes.
Thank the Honourable Member for that intervention. I do very much recognise the important work of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission and also their outreach work, their public engagement work, and also recognise the huge contribution of volunteers in service of actually promoting that work. How we commemorate and who we commemorate must reflect the full breadth of those who served and sacrificed. I hope that the first permanent memorial to the British Indian Army in the grounds of Kelvin Grove will be a testament to that. Madam Deputy Speaker, we must remember our shared past if we are to help build our shared future.
I come to the Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Monica Harding.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I want to thank the Honourable Member for Ilford South for securing this very important debate. And I, like him, want to start by sharing the story of Khudadad Khan for his extraordinary courage holding off wave after wave of German infantry in 1914. He became the first soldier of Indian origin to receive the Victoria Cross. Yet what makes his story even more remarkable is the moment in which it occurred. In late 1914, the British Expeditionary Force had lost around 70% of its original strength. Germany's armies were pushing through the Channel ports. Had they broken through, the war could very well have been lost in its first month, and the mainland Europe would have likely fallen under the domination of Imperial Germany. But the line held, and the line held in part because 45,000 soldiers from India arrived on the Western Front just in time. They had travelled thousands of miles from the subcontinent. Many arrived still wearing cotton uniforms designed for the heat of the Indian frontier, when they were suddenly thrown into the freezing mud of Flanders. They had never seen trench warfare before. They faced artillery barrages, barbed wire, machine guns, and the bitter and unfamiliar cold of a Belgian winter. Yet they stood firm, and that moment tells us something fundamental about the First World War, because the story of that war is not simply a British story, it is a Commonwealth story. Over 3 million soldiers and labourers from across the empire fought alongside Britain in the First World War. The war memorials in my own constituency of Esher and Walton bear testament to a generation who fought not alone, but shoulder to shoulder with men and women from across the Commonwealth. And the numbers alone are staggering. More than 1.4 million came from India, nearly 630,000 from Canada, over 400,000 from Australia, almost 130,000 from New Zealand, and many thousands from the West Indies, Africa, Fiji and beyond. And over 500,000 Commonwealth soldiers lost their lives. This was not a marginal contribution, it was decisive, and it altered the course of the war. Because Britain entered the war in 1914 with a relatively small professional army, around 700,000 trained soldiers in total, including reservists and territorials, and set against the vast conscript armies of the Central Powers, particularly Germany and Austro-Hungary, this force was tiny. Without reinforcements from across the empire, Britain could not have sustained the war effort. And the wartime Prime Minister David Lloyd George put it clearly. He said, had they stayed at home, the issue of the war would have been very different, and the history of the war would have taken a different course. We often hear that the arrival of the United States in 1917 tipped the balance of the war, and there is truth in that claim, but there is also a powerful argument that without the Commonwealth contribution, the war might not have lasted long enough for the Americans to arrive at all. I will give way.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way, and I was just wondering whether she would also agree with me that there was a significant contribution made by the 140,000 Chinese Labour Corps, ironically enough, who came over from 1916 to also bolster, well, to actually do a lot of the work on the front that then freed up the soldiers to be doing the fighting.
My honourable member is entirely right, and it's something I'll come back to you later, the forgotten stories of this war. So from the mud of Flanders to the deserts of the Middle East, from the jungles of East Africa to the mountains of the Balkans, Commonwealth soldiers were present in almost every theatre of the conflict. And the bravery and resilience, too often forgotten and overlooked, was one of the most notable features of the conflict. Canadian troops faced chlorine gas for the first time at the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915, holding the line. At Vimy Ridge in 1917, 4 Canadian divisions fought together as one for the first time, and in just 4 days they achieved what the French and British had spent years and over 100,000 lives bravely failing to do. And this courage was not confined to the trenches. In the skies above Europe, Canadian airmen distinguished themselves with equal daring. Fighter aces such as Billy Bishop, awarded the Victoria Cross, played a crucial role in securing Allied control of the air. Australian troops bravely fought for 8 months on the steep cliffs of Gallipoli before playing a decisive role in the final offensives of 1918. And New Zealand, with a population of barely 1 million people at that time, sent more than 120,000 soldiers overseas, and nearly 1 in 5 of them never returned. And here I want to turn to my own constituency of Esher and Walton. And it has a profound historical connection to New Zealand, dating back to the First World War. During the conflict, Walton served as a major centre for treating injured soldiers from the New Zealand Expeditionary Force, particularly those wounded in the Gallipoli campaign. And the Mount Felix mansion was converted into the first New Zealand hospital in the UK. 27,000 New Zealand soldiers were treated there. 21 New Zealand soldiers, unfortunately, are buried in St Mary's Churchyard in Walton. And we remember that in our roads. New Zealand Avenue runs through the middle of Walton, and Adelaide Avenue is there too. And since 1920, an annual Anzac Day service is held at St Mary's Church. The Mount Felix tapestry features the soldiers at the hospital, and a cowhide tree donated by the New Zealand government in 1970 stands at the former site of the hospital. So my brilliant constituents in Esher and Walton ensure that the sacrifice of those from New Zealand who served in the Great War is remembered. If I could come back to soldiers from the Caribbean that served in the British West Indies Regiment operating across Europe, Africa and the Middle East. Many of these were denied the chance by the British government to fight as equals. Instead, they were often assigned labour duties, digging trenches, unloading ships, carrying supplies. And despite that discrimination, they served with courage and dignity. And African soldiers and portents were indispensable to the campaigns across the continent, carrying ammunition and supplied through terrain that would have stopped any conventional army. They suffered catastrophic losses, but they were the logistical backbone of the campaign, and one of their story remains one of the least known chapters of the war. Women across the Commonwealth as well were also vital to the British war effort, serving as nurses, driving ambulances, working in munition factories and keeping farms and industries running. And in many schools, our students still learn about the Somme, about Passchendaele, about the Western Front, but hear very little about the role played by Indian, African, Caribbean, Australian, Canadian and Chinese forces. And as Baroness Worthy actually powerfully put it, she said, our boys weren't just Tommies, they were Tariqs and Tajinders too. So when we speak of those who served in the First World War, we're speaking about people from every corner of what was then the British Empire, people who crossed oceans to fight for a country they had never seen, people who fought in climates and conditions utterly alien to them, people who believed that they were fighting for principles, freedom, justice and the defence of small nations. And yet the response of the British government in the immediate aftermath often fell far short of the ideals which these men believed they had fought for. West Indian soldiers were excluded from the London Victory Parade. In India, promises of reform were made in return for wartime loyalty, were followed by the brutality of the Amritsar massacre. The First World War did not just reshape Europe, it reshaped the political map of the world. And the modern Commonwealth and the family of nations it represents today has its roots in the sacrifices made during that war, which brings us to the present. We must honour the shared history that binds us to the Commonwealth. So let us ensure that their contributions are fully recognised. Their services must be fully integrated into our national commemorations, their stories taught in schools, so that young people understand that the First World War was not fought by Britain alone. we must uphold the vital work of organisations such as the Commonwealth War Graves Commission and their volunteers, whose quiet dedication ensures that the name of the fallen, regardless of their nationality, faith or background, are remembered with dignity, and that we fought alongside a brave coalition of nations and peoples, of millions of individuals whose courage, labour and sacrifice made victory possible, who fought in the mud of Belgium, the deserts of Palestine, the mountains of Greece and the jungles of East Africa, and many of them, tragically, who never came home. They were asked to fight and sometimes to die for a country they had never seen. Let us, a century later, remember why they came and the bravery with which they fought, not as a footnote to history, but as an essential part of the story of how that tragic war was fought and won.
I call the Shadow Minister, Mark Francois.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. As the son of a man who fought in the Second World War, I'm privileged to be able to sum up on behalf of Her Majesty's loyal opposition in this debate about those who fell in the First, and in particularly the vital contribution that was made by Commonwealth troops during that epic conflict. It turned out to be a manpower-intensive conflict in which the contribution of Commonwealth troops was invaluable. The National Army Museum at Chelsea estimates that over 3 million soldiers and labourers from across what was then the British Empire and today the Commonwealth served alongside the British Army in multiple theatres of operations during the First World War. We've heard a number of erudite and touching tributes from honourable members to that effect this afternoon. Perhaps I could just refer to a few of them. But before I do, there is one other important point I want to make. Where are reform? Where, when we debate the contribution of people from all nations, of all colours, of all cultures, made 100 years or more ago to defending the freedom of what was then the Empire and is now the Commonwealth, why is that bench yet again empty when we debate defence-related matters? If these plastic patriots who love to wrap themselves in the flag aspire to be a party of government, let them at least come to this House and behave like it. Turning to the speeches, may I commend the Honourable Member for Ilford South for securing this debate, and then, if I may say so, for introducing it so brilliantly. He spoke memorably about the extraordinary contribution of the Indian Army, Hindu, Muslim and Sikh, all joined together as one army fighting for freedom against tyranny. He said, honour transcends borders. He was right. He was followed by my honourable friend from South West Devon, who spoke very knowledgeably about the vital work of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, not least because she worked for it, and she highlighted their marvellous endeavours to commemorate the sacrifice that were made in defence of freedom. On behalf of my party this afternoon, I would like to commend the Commonwealth War Graves Commission for everything that they do. The member for Bolton South and Walkden also spoke powerfully about the contribution of the Indian Army, especially its Muslim regiments. The member for Leicester South followed her in a similar vein and spoke in particular about the Sikh regiments, who have a proud martial tradition in British service, not least in the First World War. The other member for Alloa and Grangemouth made a very socialist contribution, if I might say so. But he also paid tribute to those who served. The member for Glasgow North also paid a fulsome tribute to Commonwealth troops. And the Liberal Democrat spokesman, the member for Esher and Walton, reminded us that after the largely regular British Expeditionary Force was wiped out holding the line in 1914, it was eventually citizens' armies, including from the Commonwealth, who replaced them to win the war. Madam Deputy Speaker, as there were multiple contributions from across the Empire and the Commonwealth during the First World War, it'd be invidious to attempt to highlight any one in particular as more important than the others. Perhaps a better way of doing it is for me to attempt to summarise very briefly, in the few minutes I have to cover a war that lasted 4 years, some of the particular national contributions to the wider war effort. So to begin with the Canadians. Following the outbreak of the war, Canada established the Canadian Expeditionary Force, the CEF, principally for service on the Western Front. The Canadians fought in many of the major battles in that theatre, including Second Ypres, the Somme, Vimy Ridge and Passchendaele. In so doing, they were also supported by troops from Newfoundland, although that did not formally become part of Canada until after the Second World War. But the Newfoundland Regiment also fought at Gallipoli and then on the Western Front, including in the so-called last 100 days, when the Allied armies, the British Army in particular, but also with Commonwealth support, broke the back of the German army in the field. This victory, fully utilising the principle of combined operations, including infantry, artillery, tanks and aircraft, working in concert, is one that should not be underestimated and is often highlighted by military historians as a significant feat of arms, completely contrary to what might be called the Blackadder version of the history of the First World War. I see the Minister is nodding in assent. Then the Australians, who also made a major contribution to the First World War, in which over 400,000 Australians served in what was known as the Australian Imperial Force, the AIF. Over half of them became casualties, either killed or wounded. Perhaps the most famous Australian contribution, combined with their comrades from New Zealand, was in the ill-fated campaign at Gallipoli in 1915, when the Australian and New Zealand troops, now forever known as the Anzacs, suffered very heavy casualties, attempting to overcome the extremely well dug-in Turkish defences on the peninsula. Nevertheless, it is also important to record that Anzac troops also served bravely in other theatres of war, not least in the Middle East and also on the Western Front. India, to whom many members have already referred this afternoon, made the largest contribution from the Commonwealth, particularly if we include those from what is now modern-day Bangladesh and Pakistan, who in total contributed, I think, over 1 million troops over the total course of the First World War. I should declare an interest here, Madam Deputy Speaker, as my great-grandfather-in-law, Colonel William Sanders, served as part of the Indian Army and at one time commanded a battery of artillery towed by elephants. Before transferring to the Royal Garrison Artillery on the Western Front, and if I may say so, winning a DSO at the Battle of St. Quentin, something about which the family are obviously very proud. But the Indian Army of today, and indeed its Bangladeshi and Pakistani counterparts, still maintain proud regimental histories that date back to their actions in the First World War. South African regiments also made an important contribution to the Allied war effort, including the 1st South African Brigade, who famously fought at Delville Wood, which the troops abbreviated to the Devil's Wood on the Somme, and given what they went through, that was probably appropriate. Although the South Africans did not just fight on the Western Front, but also against German troops on the African continent itself, including in both East and Southwest Africa. It's also important to record the contribution of some 60,000 black South Africans who served mainly in support and logistical roles rather than as frontline infantry, but who nevertheless made a very important contribution to the Allied war effort, as indeed was recognised by General Jan Smuts. Briefly, yes.
Just on that point around the South African regiments, does he agree with me that it's vital that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission continues its work to honour those labourers, which it has done with the opening of a memorial recently in Cape Town, one soon in Kenya and Sierra Leone, and a commitment to do whatever it takes to ensure that those African labourers that have not yet been commemorated are in the future?
My honourable friend is clearly a subject matter expert on this matter, but I entirely agree with her sentiment, both about the contribution of those South African labourers, but also about the vital work of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. But it's also important to commemorate the contribution of Caribbean troops to the Allied war effort, most of whom served in the West Indies Regiment, as we've heard, which saw combat in France, Italy, Africa and the Middle East. And as indeed particularly pointed out by the Honourable Member for Esher and Walton, I believe. Albeit from a different conflict, Madam Deputy Speaker, I can reveal to the House that the records of the ship's company of HMS Victory at Trafalgar record the presence of a seaman whose name was John Francois. He was on Victory, but I do not believe he was a direct relative, as he was recruited from the Caribbean. Nonetheless, I can assure the House that there was at least one Francois at Trafalgar who served on the British side. In summary, in the very limited time available this afternoon, Madam Deputy Speaker, I've only been able to refer in the briefest outline to the contribution of troops from across the British Empire and the Commonwealth to what was believed, at that time at least, to be the war to end all wars. Unfortunately, that proved not to be the case, and the world was involved in a second major conflagration barely 2 decades later. Let us passionately hope that in our lifetimes, and indeed those of our children and grandchildren, we never see a third, although I would say humbly to the Honourable Member for Alloa and Grangemouth, as the Roman military theorist Vegetus taught us, civis pacem para bellum. He who desires peace should prepare for war in order to deter it. In thinking how to conclude, I came upon some lines from Rupert Brooke in his eternal poem, The Soldier. He wrote, "If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England." Well, if that be so, and I believe it to be so, then there's also a part of a neighbouring field which is forever Canadian, Australian, New Zealander, South African, Indian, Bangladeshi, Pakistani, African and Caribbean too. Without the contribution of all those nations, from right across what was then the Empire and is now the Commonwealth, we would never have defeated the militarism of the Kaiser's Germany, and Europe undoubtedly would never have been free. We thank them all and their nations for their service, lest we forget.
Well, follow that, Minister Elkins.
Well, Deputy Madam Speaker, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, the member for Ilford South, for securing what is a very, very important debate at a very important time, and to all the honourable and right honourable members for their thoughtful contributions, and importantly, the spirit of the House in taking this debate forward. The role played by Commonwealth forces in the First World War is pivotal. Indeed, it's legendary, an all too often overlooked chapter of our nation's history. And I'm grateful to my honourable friend that this debate will help us tell that story to this generation. It is a contribution etched in stone in the heart of London, on the memorial gates on Constitution Hill, inscribed in memory of the 5 million volunteers from the Indian subcontinent, Africa and the Caribbean who fought with Britain in 2 world wars. It's a fitting memorial that honours around 3 million people from the Commonwealth who volunteered and fought in World War I, from the Indian subcontinent, from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, from Africa and as far as the Caribbean. I will.
You mentioned commemorating those who in London as well, and I've had the pleasure of, in my part of South East London, in Beckenham-on-Penge, going to see, going with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission to look at graves that they maintain. Does he agree with me they play a vital role, not only in maintaining and commemorating those who have fallen, but also educating children and young people today about the contributions they made?
I completely agree with the honourable friend. They maintain and look after thousands of memorials all over the world, which helps us continue to communicate and educate this important lesson. It's a memorial in London that commemorates the campaigns they fought, campaigns on the Western Front, in Gallipoli, Russia, the Middle East and Africa, indeed every major theatre of the conflict. And it's a memorial that rightly immortalises Commonwealth recipients of the Victoria Crosses during the Great War, including brave men like Khudada Khan, mentioned earlier, a courageous soldier in the British Indian Army who single-handedly held back the enemy to enable reinforcements to arrive, the first non-British recipient of our highest military honour during the First World War. Of the 1 million people under British command killed during the First World War, nearly a quarter came from the Commonwealth nations. Having served in multiple theatres of conflict to protect the country that I'm really proud to call home, and having lost good colleagues and friends, I have some ideas of the sacrifice they loyally made, but not in any way, shape or form at the scale. Over 74,000 people came from India, 65,000 from Canada, more than 62,000 from Australia, 18,000 from New Zealand and nearly 12,000 from South Africa. Their names are recorded by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission across the cemeteries and memorials on every continent. With dedicated memorials inaugurated or under construction in Cape Town, in Nairobi and Freetown in Sierra Leone. Commonwealth forces are honoured prominently during remembrance, with Commonwealth High Commissioners playing a high-profile role in commemorations at the cenotaph, but we must do more. Indeed, today we remember their service and their sacrifice, and I'm delighted their legacy lives on in our armed forces. Turning to some of the comments made in the House, Madam Deputy Speaker, the honourable friend from Ilford South made some really poignant remarks. Different languages, different cultures and different faiths came together to fight for a common good, demonstrating incredible honour, unbelievable duty and outstanding courage. And I think the key lesson from that was it doesn't matter where you come from, your religion, your race, they were united in a common cause. The honourable member from South West Devon was right to point out the outstanding work that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission does, and I commend her for her support to it in the past and ongoing. It commemorates 1.7 million casualties across the globe, and even right now we have 5,000 Commonwealth personnel serving in the British military. Our honourable friend from Bolton, South Walton, the story about a wireless operator deployed behind enemy lines, covertly inserted into France, is truly remarkable. It's describing how Commonwealth forces or forces from individuals from further afield did every part of the operational tapestry, both in the First and Second World War. And the honourable friend from Leicester South highlighted how our histories are entwined, but in some cases we fail to educate and communicate that in particular to the youth of the nation, and highlights the requirement, if we're to push in the same direction, we must understand our shared history and that common cause, which is one of democracy, the rule of law, the right to self-determination and equal rights. The honourable friend from Alloa and Grangemouth highlighted some interesting comments, and he mentioned war is easy to talk about. Well, I'll tell you now that war, if you've been engaged in it, is not easy to talk about. And I would say that the best way to avoid conflict is to deter it. And I support the honourable member from Rayleigh and Wickford's comments that you don't deter it by not preparing for it. I tried to keep politics out of this debate, but this isn't about the lack of realism, this is about remembrance. The honourable friend from Glasgow North again mentioned education, communication to bind us together, to build bridges and remove the division that people are sowing within the country, to deal in unity, to deal in hope and ambition, to drive the country forward, and I completely commend that narrative. The honourable member from Esher Walton pointed to the staggering contributions from across the Commonwealth that I think we've heard from so many people, and such a poignant thing to dwell on. And then finally, the honourable member from Rayleigh and Wickford highlighted the lack of individuals from certain parties in this House today. Well, I'll tell you where they are. They're probably out on social media, painting the sky grey, and then selling the country umbrellas. And I think it is an absolute travesty that they're not here today to hear about the joint history that every member has mentioned, talks about the shared sacrifice and talks about what unity can indeed overcome. I also commend the points made about the early stages of combined arms manoeuvre, something that we're seeing in Ukraine with the use of uncrewed systems, which is changing how we fight. And unfortunately, conflict tends to be the mother of invention. I think my final point would be that when individuals from the Commonwealth came to fight from other countries, it was a huge unifying factor because bombs, bullets and battlefields don't discriminate. They served together, they died together, and now we must focus on how we tell the story to ensure that we live together. I'd like to close by again expressing my gratitude to my honourable friend for securing this debate. I'm pleased we've had the chance to mark the loyalty, the courage and indeed the sacrifice of Commonwealth soldiers during the First World War. More than a century later, their legacy still inspires many young men and women. We must do more to honour their sacrifice and indeed increase our ability to collectively recruit people into the British Armed Forces from all walks of life. Indeed, as our debate has shown, their legacy continues to inspire us all. Thank you.
Jazz Athwal to wind up.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank all my colleagues, friends, honourable friends, right honourable friends who have contributed to this debate. It's really appreciated, and certainly as I close the debate, I'd just like to make a declaration that my paternal great-grandfather served in the First World War. My maternal grandfather served in the Second World War. And I just want to quote the words of General Sir Ian Hamilton, because I often remember this quote and it reminds me, and I never met my great-grandfather. He'd passed away before I was born. But if I wanted to remember him, I wanted to remember him like this. So writing to the Commander-in-Chief shortly afterwards, General Sir Ian Hamilton paid noble tribute to the heroism of all ranks of the Firozpur Sikhs. In the highest sense of the word, extreme gallantry has been shown by this fine battalion. In spite of these tremendous losses, there was not a sign of wavering all day. Not an inch of ground gained was given up, and not a single straggler came back. The ends of the enemy's trenches leading into the ravine were found to be blocked by the bodies of Sikhs and of the enemy who died fighting at close quarters, and the glacier slopes is thickly dotted with the bodies of these fine soldiers, all lying on their faces as they fell in their steady advance on the enemy going forward. Thank you.
The question is as on the order paper. As many as of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. I will allow a couple of moments for the front benches to swap over.